Welcome to another episode of Monster Monday from the Ready to Die channel. This series explores the design of a creature I have built for Pathfinder 2nd Edition. The stat block for this creature can be found over on the Monster Monday blog, as well as the Twitter and Discord, all of which are linked below. I suppose you could say that I rose to the occasion for this week's build as I present the Espinas from Monster Hunter.
But I guess that's why they say every rose has its thorn.
This is one of those monsters that actually originated in Monster Hunter Frontier, before making the jump into a mainline game with the Sunbreak expansion of Monster Hunter Rise. This fearsome flying wyvern easily takes up the dragon trait. The folks over at Monhun are way too liberal with what they apply the term wyvern to, but the Espinas is one of those where it actually seems appropriate. However, its level was a little bit more difficult to figure out, because while its contemporaries are the likes of Rathian, Nargacuga, and Zenogre, the Espinas will have turf wars with the Elder Dragon Kushala Daora. And it doesn't even lose. The fight kind of ends in a draw. However, poison is particularly potent against this powerful creature, so I leaned more into the other creatures it is more regularly associated with, and settled on level 12. This gave me a solid starting point for the design of this deadly drake, so let's go ahead and get into that. The Espinas is extraordinarily durable, which led to the use of an extreme constitution, though it is also a very burly beast. Its strength is high to account for the might that it demonstrates when it's charging about the battlefield. It uses a low dexterity and wisdom, with the form based on the fact that the Espinas is not one of those acrophobic wyverns. It'll take to the air periodically and doesn't seem to be too terrible a flyer. And this is also the reason the Espinas uses a low acrobatics, letting it better maneuver while in flight. It has a low stealth, which I originally didn't include, but as I was reading through its lore again, it mentioned that the Espinas employs camouflage to hunt its smaller prey, such as poison toads and hermitars and other poisonous creatures. This camouflage is why its stealth becomes almost high when it's in its proper environment. Its strength lends to a high athletics skill, though I didn't actually include any features to really take advantage of it. Now, in addition to these skills, the Espinas has a terrible perception. This is a creature you gotta keep in mind that this guy will sleep through getting attacked, which might make it one of the most oblivious monsters from Monster Hunter. You might be asking, how is it that the Espinas is able to just snooze through an assault? And that gets revealed by looking at its defenses. We're starting with a high armor class, which is pretty standard as part of my designs. It tends to feel the best when I'm testing creatures during the Monster Mash, but countering this high AC is below moderate hit points. It's not quite low, but it is a bit below moderate, and this is due to me trying to balance its immunities, weaknesses, and resistances. First off, the Espinas is a somewhat standard fire-breathing dragon, and it has an immunity to fire, as well as poison. The hide of the Espinas is hard enough to resist most blows, which we see with a resistance to all physical damage, except for the classic exception of adamantine. Then, finally, it has a weakness to cold damage based on its resistances and weaknesses within Monster Hunter. But this ability to ignore physical damage is what allows the Espinas to simply sleep through the assault of hunters. I went for a fairly standard array with the Espinas' saving throws, starting with a high fortitude, then going to a moderate reflex, and finishing off with a low will save. Despite its wisdom and dexterity being the same value, an awake Espinas is a bit more nimble than it is mentally resilient. Rounding out the numbers of our rampaging rows is its basic offensive capabilities, which features 3 strikes. Both of its jaws and tail have a moderate attack bonus, with the former having high damage and the latter using a moderate damage value. This is the case for the tail due to its larger reach and the inclusion of its sweep trait, which is kind of like a discount agile trait. It's from the bargain bin. The Espinas also has a horn strike with a low attack bonus, but both high damage and a venom that it spreads. I honestly had a lot of trouble landing this in the Monster Mash, but part of that was just lucky rolls for the players, and me trying to test out the full extent of the Espinas' abilities. Before we start talking about all of those, let's take a look at this aforementioned toxin. The Thorns venom fulfills a couple of purposes. The Espinas is able to inflict both the paralyzed and poisoned conditions in Monster Hunter, but I wrapped up those 2 effects into this singular toxin. It uses a moderate DC, mostly because my exposure to poisons within Pathfinder, from both sides of the screen, is that they are brutal, so I might just be a little cautious in their use. It does start off with some pretty basic damage, but as players succumb to it, their body begins to stiffen until, by stage 4, they are fully paralyzed. This simplifies that aspect of the Espinas a bit, in what I personally believe to be a rather graceful combination of features. I stuck with a maximum duration of 6 rounds, as it does seem to be the favored duration even for higher leveled creatures, and because the Espinas has more than enough damage in its kit, which we will see as we get into these other abilities. Since it ties into the Thorns venom, let's take a look at the Espinas' Thorns next. This passive effect discourages enemies from hitting the Espinas by dealing unlimited use area damage to creatures that do so with a moderate save DC. This uses at lower value, since this is a passive effect that triggers with each melee blow against the Espinas. And if a creature happens to critically fail that save, they get exposed to the Thorns venom. This ability does borrow quite heavily from the Pukwudgie, but differs by having an actual value assigned to its DC. The Espinas is known for charging at enemies, and I actually took 2 ways to represent the rampages of this rosy Ravager. The first is a very standard trample effect, that deals damage from the horn and has a high DC save. I use trample specifically as one of its abilities because the Espinas is known to run over hunters like a freight train, but I also wanted a more classical charge in its kit, which led to the inclusion of Wild Charge. I covered both forms of the Espinas' movement here, letting it simply charge or swoop down upon its prey, and aside from the action compression, the biggest benefit of this ability is the increase to the Espinas' attack roll. It still doesn't quite hit moderate value, but going any higher in a game where a +2 is a big bonus felt wrong, so I kinda kept it nice and simple. Speaking of simple, what kind of dragon would the Espinas be if it didn't have at least some sort of breath weapon? For the Espinas, that comes in the form of its blossoming blaze, meant to represent the fireballs that it can launch. Now, it seems to be able to do this pretty regularly, leading to the use of a low cooldown, but it still isn't quite as common of an effect as it appears to be in Monster Hunter. On the number side of things, it deals limited use area damage as it does explode like a fireball, and requires the victims of it to make a high DC reflex save. And while that seems fine enough, fans of the MH series may notice some aspects of this ability that are missing, and that is because I have saved those for the Espinas' final ability. Blooming Fury is intended to represent the enraged effect of the Espinas, which isn't usually a type of ability that I include for these creatures. But it is important for using on the Espinas because it causes it to completely change how it operates. In-game, the drowsy Espinas can fly into an absolutely frenzied fury, at the cost of the toughness of its skin. And this is actually described in the lore of the game. The expansion of blood vessels makes the Espinas' skin softer. This is some neat design that I 100% wanted to incorporate into my take on this creature. Now, the Fury itself is triggered when the Espinas is reduced to half health, or it feels like its life is in danger, such as when it takes a critical hit. The following Fury lasts a minute and starts with a loss of the Espinas' physical resistance, resembling that expansion of the blood vessels, but in return, it gets a tiny bit of temporary hit points, and that's mostly mechanical. It's just so that the Espinas doesn't go down too quick once it triggers this. Damage that increases pretty much all of its strikes by 1 step, and causes it to become quickened, purely to represent the sheer ferocity with which it starts attacking. Now, as if all that wasn't enough, the Espinas also adds its Thorns venom to its blossoming blaze, to represent this ability in its entirety. Having the poison just constantly on for the fireballs would have required them losing power elsewhere, and I mostly didn't want to do that. I kinda liked where they were at. As we come into the end here, I initially didn't have a plan for any Espinas equipment, but when I saw their dual blades sitting there with their fire and poison, I got inspired. Based on the shape of the Rosenzahn and their dual nature, I decided to make them Wind and Fire Wheels, or Fang Hu Lun. Their benefit only happens when they're dual wielded, and causes the extra damage from the twin trait to become persistent fire and poison damage. I also wrapped up the demon mode into this weapon with its rampage through roses, which has the added benefit of representing the Espinas' own rage. But with that, we have covered our thorny terror. This rosy reaper rampages with rapidity while ravaging the running rid of rivals with venom most virulent, vehemently violating veins with violence. I had a lot of fun building the Espinas. Definitely makes me want to track it down in Monster Hunter Rise and have a face-off against it. In addition to more classic encounters that you could run with the Espinas, you could also stretch the idea of encounter a little bit with the concept that the Espinas is a surprisingly docile and sleepy creature that other monsters fear. The heroes could be tasked by a village to lure an Espinas into a nest that they prepared for it, so that they can adopt it as a sort of incidental protector of their village. But that's just my idea. Feel free to come up with your own, and then let me know what you think of this creature, as well as what other ones you would like to see. You can check out the Monster Monday blog, Twitter, or Discord for the other monsters I've made, and all of that is linked below. Thanks for watching, and have a monstrous Monday.